didn't we meet having dinner with Andre Nakayama and Sean Croston?
We totally did.
That's how we met.
Pretty cool dream team. Some of those people are famous, not necessarily us.
Not us, but that's okay. But that's how I remember meeting you.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and it's a shame because when I lived there, we barely ever hung out. We did go to dinner with Kieran one time. That was super fun. But we probably talk now more that I don't live there, which is how it goes. But frankly, I was just talking to one of my old staff member, and I was just such a little workhorse while I lived there. You know, I'm running a clinic. I was working late, and my schedule is so refreshingly different now, which is really nice. So yeah, it's like kind of something I try to teach about. Okay, hold on. So while we're chatting, I'm just going to put the link to Lara's course that we'll talk about later in the notes. I'll read her bio in a sec, but I've taken two of your live courses, and then I purchased one of the home study courses. So hold on one second. It's always slow to get everything going when it's Facebook Live. Okay, well, let me read your bio and then I'll tell you more about my experience. So Lara Adler is an environmental toxins expert and educator and a certified holistic health coach who teaches health coaches, nutritionists, and other holistic health practitioners how to eliminate the number one thing holding their clients back from the results they are seeking, the unaddressed link between chemicals and chronic health problems. She trains practitioners to become experts in everyday toxic exposures so they can improve client outcomes without spending hundreds of hours researching on their own. Combining environmental health education and business consulting, she's helped thousands of health professionals in over 25 countries around the world elevate their skill set, get better results for their clients, and become sought-out leaders in the growing environmental health and detoxification field. Lara is a member of the National Association of Environmental Medicine and the American Holistic Health Association. That's a good resume, girl.
Well, thanks.
So I better step it up. That sounded really good. So I met Lara personally from having friends in the health space, but as I said earlier, I've taken some of her courses, and I wanted to first share why I've done that, which is that the topic of toxins, like when you're trying to advise people on what seafood to choose, or what type of flooring to buy, or any number of things. Why am I not losing weight? You need to understand toxins, and just like she said in the bio, I don't have time to put in a gazillion hours studying every type of fish and all this stuff. So that's why I signed up, and you can sign up as a health professional or a health enthusiast, right? Which is my entire audience is one of those two things. We're very knowledgeable. I say we because my community is just as knowledgeable as I am, but we all have little gaps to fill in. And knowing different types of plastic and hair coloring, and it's too much. Nobody knows all that except Lara. Honestly, there's no one like her that I've ever met, and she's incredibly smart, and she's runs a great business in that it's so organized and easy to learn. So I'm very thankful I met her, and we just kind of drip little bits of that into my business. But I also learned through time, we can't teach it all, right? So we teach a lot of detox, and I really want to have Lara on regularly to bring in this toxins education piece, because that's really where she shines.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak to your people. I want to just mention two things. One, so my business, my courses, Talking Toxins, all my other courses, they're geared towards health professionals, but I use that term really broadly, meaning it's licensed, it's unlicensed, and it is health enthusiasts. It's moms that are concerned about the health of their kids, and they don't want to just, have a buy this, don't buy that understanding. They want to really understand the complexities and the subtleties and the nuance of this conversation. And so, there's no requirement that somebody be a health professional to learn from me. It's just that's who my courses are primarily designed for. So anybody is welcome. So I wanted to say that first. And then the other thing is, it's what I love about what you do, Bridget, is that you really have taken this obviously super important aspect of this whole conversation about environmental toxins and focused it on the detox process. And the bulk of what I teach is the step that actually happens before that. It certainly can happen during that, but it usually starts before, and that's avoidance. Meaning, what are we being exposed to and how do we reduce or minimize that exposure in as many places as possible? And when we couple avoidance behaviors with the detox interventions, whether it's sauna or supplements or whatever, like, as I always like to say, like, that's where the magic happens, right? Where we practice avoidance and then we help facilitate the elimination of the stuff that we can't avoid or that's built up inside our bodies. And so I think that's why this, this conversation is going to be really
good
exciting.
pairing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll talk about later some detox resources I want to share kind of as a bonus here. And then what was the other thing I was going to mention? Oh, just a format for today. So you're lucky to be here. We have a bunch of great slides Lara prepared. But then we really want to take questions. So just kind of whetting your appetite to like the things that she can teach, because we can't cover it all today, but we're going to dive deep. Yeah, we're going to dive deep into certain things. And you're right, it's so nuanced. It's like you teach about water filtration. And I know you get the question, well, what's the best filter? And it's not that simple. It probably drives you crazy to keep having to explain it. But
occupational hazard, I say.
That's just the way it is. It's not straightforward.
It's not straightforward. And I think that's why I was saying before we, really kind of just stepped into this is a conversation that has a tremendous amount of subtlety and nuance. And it really benefits from dialogue because there are very rarely pat answers that apply to everyone universally. As I like to say, the answer to most questions is it depends.
Yeah. And I know when I was in your advanced course, a conversation we had a lot is it's tough, like in my position, to recommend products and companies because it's also like not the same thing as a fit for everyone, or a company is making a great product and then they're kind of not making a great product. So that was a tough one for me that we're still, kind of struggling with. So anyway, well, can you see if it'll let you share slides?
Yes. I have to, it says host disabled, so you have to like promote me to something.
Don't use the most promoted thing. Okay. Maybe I have to make you a host.
I think you have to make me a co-host.
You're already a co-host.
Well,
so just give it back. Just give it back is all I'm asking.
Okay, now I am the host.
Now you're the host.
Sweet. So can you see my slides?
Perfect. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. So this is, I'm not going to read this because this is just an intro. And you basically just told me these things. Said this to everybody. I've had thousands of students in over 26 countries. My goal is not just to share education around environmental toxicity, but for those people that are health professionals to really help them integrate this conversation into their practices in a way that works and that is attractive to their audience. So it really is sort of a 1-2.
Yeah, she's a great business coach. And as we said, if you're just sort of a health enthusiast, you're still trying to have these conversations with your friends. Maybe you're considering becoming a health coach later. So it's nice to have that extra, because it is, there's a reason we don't hear about all this enough. One reason is it's tough to communicate. So she's going to help.
Yes, it definitely can be. And knowing how to communicate this in a way that is not sensational or overwhelming is so important, because there's a lot of that in this space. So before we get into specifics, I'd like to start with some context. Bridget, you know me, I always contextualize. Contextualizing for me lays the framework of what it is that we're going to talk about so that it makes sense to everybody. And know that pretty much everything that's in this presentation in terms of the slides and what I'm going to be sharing is extracted from the Talking Toxins course. Bridget put a link in the chat already, but it kind of gives you a sneak peek into what I do and how I teach and all that stuff, and a little bit into this course. So I think it's pretty fair to say that most people in the space, and certainly everybody in your audience, Bridget, because they're in your audience, you know, is aware that the research into environmental chemical exposures, both natural and man-made, right? So lead is natural, arsenic is natural, mercury is natural, they're still toxic. Has been, certainly this research has been happening for decades, but I'd really say that over the last 20 years, really even in the last 10 years, that awareness has picked up in concert with the amount of research that has picked up. You know, I set Google alerts for a couple of search terms, and I remember when I first set those up like 7 or 8 years ago, like I would get a Google alert for, you know, new studies, you know, once a week maybe, and there would be like 2 or 3 papers. Now I get them every single day, and there's like between 6 and 10 papers.
That's amazing.
Every day. Like it's, I don't even
know. Full like research papers.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they're editorials or comments or, you know, whatever,
Okay.
but they're Google Scholar alerts. So they're, you know, academic papers, but it's just a reflection of how the uptick in research is just really exploded.
That's great.
And you know what, so also has this research that's, you know, really looking at, you know, how the uptick in chronic disease cannot be explained by genetics alone. And that's where we start seeing where chemicals can play. You know, rates of a ton of chronic diseases, chronic illnesses are on the rise. And this is despite all of the access to information about health that we have, like these diseases are still on the uptick. And it's not one cause, it's a lot of causes. This is a single graph. I've got some other ones in the next couple slides that's just mapping the synthetic chemical production. Look, we start in the 1930s, and then in the early 1940s, it picks up because that's post World War II or around World War II. And then this is overlaying percentage of overweight in adults. Now, obviously, this is not causation. This is just a correlation graph, but it is indicative of what we see when we start mapping the rates of disease. They all follow the same.
Right, autism, I've seen the same chart. Yeah.
And so like this is this 1935 Better Living Through Chemistry, and like that's happening right around here. And so once that's commercialized and popularized, that's when we see post World War II, all those munitions factories that were building bombs suddenly started making fertilizers and then plastics and all of this stuff. And so that's really what we were seeing. Is that Pinto? Is that my sweet baby Pinto?
100%.
Okay. I love
Somebody's at the door, so crisis.
Okay. Yeah, so this is what I was just saying. Since World War II, the production of chemicals has increased more than 20-fold. Since 1979, that's not that long ago. I say that because I was born in 1977, so that makes me feel not old if I say it wasn't that long ago.
Just a second ago.
The number of chemicals has grown by over 30%. And so this is what I was talking about in terms of, you know, if we look at the progression or the increase in chronic disease, like this one over here is thyroid cancer, this is melanoma, this is liver and intrahepatic bile duct cancer, this is diabetes, this is MS, Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, and asthma, and then we have autism. So like, you know, obviously, like I said, these are not causative. These are simply just pointing out that what we're seeing is this massive increase in chronic disease. And we're also seeing a similar increase in environmental chemicals. It's part of the bigger conversation. It's part of what is happening here.
Yeah, it's so true. I just to see like, you know, nothing's coming down. Everything's.
Yeah, I mean, you know, certainly there are some things that are coming down, but good. Like it's not across the board that everything's going up. But there are, you know, there's certain types of cancers that are decreasing. But even then, you have to get granular with your research, because are you looking at incident rates or are you looking at death rates? Because death rates are going to go down because we have more medical interventions. What we're more interested in is incidence rates.
Okay.
And so, and what we see is that disease rates are rising faster than can be explained by genetics. I mentioned that just a minute ago. And this, according to the National Institutes of Health, and there's some slightly different perspectives on these numbers, but according to the NIH, only 5 to 10% of cancers can be attributed to genetics. So what that means is 90 to 95% are due to environment. And environment within this context is everything that's not genetic. So it's your diet, it's whether or not you drink, I mean, if we look here, alcohol, diet, tobacco, infections, obesity, and certainly environmental exposures are going to fall into that category. So environment here doesn't mean toxic chemicals, it just means like your lifestyle stuff. But what that tells us is that 90 to 95% of cancers are likely preventable.
Wow.
Right? Likely preventable. And so whether we're working in the health field or we have cancer in our family, or we just don't want to get cancer in our family, it really shines a spotlight on like why interventions, preventative behaviors, lifestyle modifications that can help minimize things that will increase risk factors is so important. And environmental chemicals certainly is one of those things that increases risk factors. For a really long time, this topic was like fringe, and you were thought to be like a wacko if you talked about, quote, toxic chemicals, but that ship, I feel like, has sailed for the most part. And that it's, among the leaders in the integrative and functional medical space, at least in that bubble, but this is now expanding into conventional medicine, which is really good to see, is that, the leaders in these communities really recognize that toxicity is a key factor in the development of disease. Mark Hyman, everybody knows that. He has a lot to say on the role that environmental toxins play. Dr. Joseph Pizzorno, he's the founder of Bastyr University, among other things, and he's the author of The Toxin Solution, which everybody can go out and get. It's a really easy read. It's a great primer. His position is that toxicity is the primary driver of disease, that it is the underlying cause of all of the cellular dysfunction and inflammation and hormonal imbalances and gut imbalances and all of these things that precipitate disease states later on. So I think that that's like such a big sort of call to action that like, this is a big deal. It's not a fringe topic. And, the reality is that in these environmental chemicals that we're being exposed to a little bit here, a little bit there, every single day, are linked to pretty much all of the serious, and some of these are, maybe less serious, but they're all things that people are dealing with, all of these chronic health issues, hormone imbalance, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, weight gain, diabetes, obesity, autoimmune, fertility, cancers. All of these things do have an environmental component. And I think that that's why it's so important that it's not just about diet and exercise. It's not just about, popping some supplements that are going to help. It's really about practicing avoidance. And if we are working with other people, teaching other people how to practice avoidance as well. And so I think that is the deal. However, and this is really where my work kind of finds its little nook to hang out in, is addressing this massive education gap that exists. So most health professionals, practitioners, don't have a clue about environmental toxicity. A couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast with a palliative care doctor in Canada. And he was like, I'm so fascinated by this topic because I know nothing about it. Like, not a thing. I know nothing about toxicity. And he's working in a hospital. And granted, he's working in palliative care. It's a different, arena of medicine. But he was like, I'm fascinated and I know nothing. I'm totally ignorant about this. And so that wasn't a surprise to me because there's just such a small amount of education. So in the medical doctor community, in the nutrition space, which I have a lot of colleagues in the nutrition space, we get kind of our feathers ruffled when we're like, oh, most medical doctors don't have any training in nutrition. They have about 19 to 21 hours, which obviously is not sufficient. They're not in preventative care. They're in, emergency medicine, typically, well, not typically, but you know what I'm saying? They're not in that kind of lifestyle education stuff.
That illness.
Yes, they're
management.
In diagnosis and, treatment. That is the arena. But when it comes to, and so we recognize that number of hours in nutrition is like not even close to being sufficient. But when it comes to environmental health, the number is significantly less. They get on average, if their program offers education, they only get about average of 7 hours. And those 7 hours are looking at things like smoking or drug abuse or occupational exposures for people working in a factory. It's not looking at the real life scenario of using shampoo and using shaving cream and laundry detergent, household cleaners and mattresses that have chemicals and sofas that have flame retardants. They don't talk about those things. They don't look at that. And that's where we need to see a shift. So this is a 2016 article from the American Association of Medical Colleges. They sum up this situation pretty succinctly. They say an Institute of Medicine report 20 years ago, so that was in 2016, framed the need for an environmental health perspective in medical practice and suggested 6 related learning objectives for medical students. In a study of pediatricians in 2006, however, just 1 in 5 had received training in environmental history taking, just the history taking. An earlier study reported that in medical schools requiring content related to environmental medicine, students received just 7 hours. Nearly 1/4 of schools surveyed didn't require any. And that graduates found that more than 1/3 respondents said they received inadequate instruction in environmental health. So there's just like no training. Here's another quote from another article. Environmental medicine education is largely omitted from US medical education. So what we have are health professionals who just like, not only do they not understand it, but because they don't understand it, they're likely to dismiss it, which means that the consumer is left to figure this out on their own, and that's a problem. And this certainly goes into other professions as well. This is a nursing, pediatric medical nursing education lacks environmental health content necessary to appropriately prepare pediatric health professionals. So they've received no formal training in occupational or environmental health. So that's the gap that I am trying to fill. I'm trying to fill this education gap so that the health professionals, licensed, unlicensed, and again, you don't have to be a health professional to dive into this, that we can fill that gap so that we can develop the fluency needed to engage with our clients, patients, customers. The reality is, and again, Bridget, I know your audience knows this because they're following you and they're dialed into this conversation, but that general consumer awareness about environmental chemicals has now surpassed the awareness in the medical field. So what you have are consumers trying to figure this out on their own because they can't go to their doctor to ask a question about what plastic is okay to use for their babies, or hey, I'm having hormone problems, like what's a safe skincare product? They're like, I don't know, all of them are safe is probably the answer that you're gonna get. And so that's my goal, is to fill that gap, and we're gonna do a little bit of that right now. So 2 seconds so that we all just understand that we're on the same page. What are we talking about when we're talking about these environmental chemicals that we're being exposed to every day? So right now there's about 100,000 to 150,000 chemicals in use worldwide. We don't actually have a hard number because different countries have different systems for tracking, whether they track chemicals at all. And different countries have different ways to regulate them. Not all chemicals are bad. I just want to say that right out of the gate. We do not want to brush or tar everything with the same brush. Not all chemicals are harmful. And so when we're talking about environmental chemicals, we want to be precise in our language and make sure that we are not making blanket statements that are not accurate, because there's a lot of people just waiting for someone to say something inaccurate so they can discredit them. So many chemicals are totally fine. They're totally safe. They've benefited us, made our lives better and safer. What we are concerned with in this conversation are the ones that are or are suspected to cause problems. The Toxic Substances Control Act is our primary piece of public policy. There's other ones, but this is the primary one that regulates chemicals, was created in 1976. And it has an innocent until proven guilty framework, which is super problematic, which means that chemicals don't really truly need to be tested for safety prior going to market. And the onus was on like our government, the Environmental Protection Agency, to actually prove something was harmful after it was already in the marketplace causing harm, which is super stupid, but that's how we do it. So this was just considered a very weak policy. In the US, there's 86,000 chemicals that are on the registry. They did an analysis, I think last year, and they were like, oh wait, a big chunk of those, they're still on the registry, but they are not actively being used. So that number is pretty small. But 62,000 chemicals were grandfathered in when TSCA was passed. So it means that they just got a free pass. Like, yeah, they're fine. So the majority of chemicals in the marketplace, no one's ever looked at them to see whether or not they're safe. No one's ever looked. Less than 200 chemicals of those were actually tested for safety. So when people tell you that, you know, products wouldn't be for sale if they weren't safe, that's not true. It's just not true. It's not real. It's not factual.
Yeah.
No one's testing them. There's no requirement that they are tested prior to being sold in the marketplace. There just isn't. So, you know, I think it's important to recognize that. They're also not adequately tested because they're looking through the lens of traditional toxicology. I'm not going to get into this here, but there's a whole explanation inside the first module inside Talking Toxins, where we talk about the dose makes the poison, and in where that's not always true. And when it comes to environmental chemicals, this is really important because traditional toxicology testing is looking for acute effects like brain cancer, tumors, changes in organ weight, and death. Like those are the endpoints that they're looking for when they're looking at high doses of exposures. They're not looking for chronic, long-term health effects from low doses, despite the fact that that's the reality in which we live. So the traditional toxicology testing is not really adequate for our sort of lived experience in terms of these exposures. And I think that's a real problem. So the question that often comes up is, just because there's chemicals in these products, like that doesn't necessarily mean they're in people, except that they are. And what we have is, you know, the CDC, our Centers for Disease Control, and other countries around the world do this as well. They're constantly testing through these biomonitoring studies to see like what chemicals are in the US population, and everywhere they look, they find them. And so NHANES is one of the largest US-based, population-based surveys that helps us identify, you know, the levels of lead in the population, or the levels of, you know, perchlorate or whatever other chemicals, or bisphenols. This is how we know that 93% of the US population has metabolites of BPA in their urine, is because of data like this. Their most recent report has found that there's more than 212 man-made chemicals, and some chemicals have been found in, you know, almost everybody. And what's interesting is they've only tested 212 chemicals, and wow, there's 212 they found. So if they broaden that search, you can bet that that number will increase. So like I said, everywhere they're looking for them, they're finding them. Now, asterisk, small print, just because a chemical is present doesn't mean it's causing harm, right? So we want to be clear on that. However, there are a lot of chemicals in us that research in animal studies and epidemiological studies that are showing, these ones seem to be really problematic, and it's even more so problematic that they're like widespread showing up in people. And this is just an example of blood lead levels. we see here in 1976 to 1980, the blood lead levels were super high. And then as we started to intervene with, getting lead out of paint or lead out of gasoline, we would see that those levels were dropping. And it was actually data from NHANES that made this possible, this population-wide data that tells us, oh crap, we have a problem, like nationally and probably globally, that we need to do something about. However, when it comes to us as individuals, like, we don't have the time to wait for policy changes. We just don't, because this is like it moves at a glacial pace, if at all. And so the onus is on the consumer, on us as individuals, to start making changes in our own lives, to start reducing exposures that will not be regulated by the government just because of a lot of different scenarios. So, this is like, we'll zero in on a specific, we're going to talk about BPA, but this is just another example of chemicals are in us. And there's been a couple follow-up studies to this, but I think it was in 2009, the Environmental Working Group tested umbilical cord blood from 10 babies that I think was a fairly diverse sample, a very small sample size, but still diverse. And they found hundreds of industrial chemicals. And if you look at the numbers here, you're like, okay, there's 287 pollutants, 180 carcinogens, 217 of them were neurotoxins, 208 were reproductive toxins. Those numbers added together obviously are more than 287. The reason why is because a single chemical can be both neurotoxic and reproductive toxin and a carcinogen at the same time. So some chemicals play double duty. So that's just an interesting fact. But the reality is that, like, we all have some degree of chemicals in us. And this is where, Bridget, your detox work is so powerful. But again, we have to stop new exposures from happening. So does anybody, were there any questions that came in that you think would be worth pausing to answer?
I think there's just been some commentary, but I don't think any specific.
Okay, sweet. Well, if there are specific questions that y'all have, and I know I'm talking fast, I have so much I want to share, and this is, I don't talk this fast in my classes, but I just want to make
sure kind of fast. I mean, I think that's what my audience likes. It's like, don't mess around.
Yeah.
And then we can have time to
answer questions. Awesome. So, BPA is one of those chemicals that I think most people are aware of. Like, I'm sure everybody who's listening has heard of it. Awareness of this chemical doesn't always translate into action. This is especially important for any health professionals that might be listening, because just because your client or customer is aware doesn't mean that they're doing things to reduce exposures. It's primarily found, I don't even want to say primarily, it's found in plastics. It's certainly not in all plastics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but it is representative of how plastics behave. So we're going to be talking about it through that lens primarily. It's also found in canned foods, doesn't matter if it's an organic canned food, and it's also found in cash register receipts or thermal paper. These are sort of our primary places where we're going to interact with BPA. Like, if you have plastic glasses, it's in your glasses, but you're not interacting with your glasses in a way that would lead to any meaningful exposure, but you will if you're drinking out of a plastic bottle or reheating your leftovers in plastic. So that's why we focus on those areas.
Yeah, and I just want to pause and say, like, I picked BPA for Lara to focus on, not because, like, I don't know how to, so because it's something a lot of people have heard of, but there isn't like a real understanding. It's like, oh, I've heard of that. And right. That's kind of where and there's so much to it that we're about to find out. So this is just one example. She's got so many others. But
oh my gosh. Yes. Yeah. Just one, like, micro zoom in on one specific topic. And every,
even this simple one that you feel like, oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
There's so much more to it that you can share with your clients, that you can use in your own family. And it just gives you a sense of, like, all, the whole rabbit hole
right.
to go down here.
Yeah. And, I'll get into this a little bit more, but like, you know, this chemical and this family of chemicals are linked to, you know, hormone disruption, weight gain, insulin resistance, diabetes, early onset puberty, asthma, heart disease. Like, it's linked to serious health issues. So this is not just like this hippie, like, BPA is bad, BPA free. Like, it's not about that. These are about serious chronic health issues. Now, this is helpful to understand when we're talking about plastics. So plastics are made of strings of polymers mixed together in a specific way, like a recipe, to create different types of plastics. You know, there's different types of plastics in that, like, some are flexible and transparent, others are opaque, others are really rigid and hard. And the recipe is what determines the sort of final product of what kind of plastic it is. Now, in plastics, BPA is there primarily to make plastics rigid and hard, right? Not soft and flexible, but rigid and hard. So think of like your food processor bowl or your Vitamix blender or your Nalgene bottle that is plastic, but it basically looks like glass. That is what we're predominantly looking at when we're looking at plastics and BPA. Now, when it comes to plastics, this is a role that BPA plays. It makes it hard. BPA technically can be found in other types of plastics that aren't rigid. So like your coffee cup lid has other types of plastics that make it flexible, but then BPA is added to make it a little bit more rigid. So you will find
that's like the reusable coffee cups?
No, like if you go to Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks and they just stick that like white plastic lid.
Gotcha.
The problem with that, and you'll understand this more in a second, is that you know, heat is one of the things that can increase the way that the molecules are shed and release. And if we think about, you know, like, oh, I have my hot tea or my hot coffee, and it's heating up the plastic lid, and then the water's steam is condensing, and then that's falling back into our drink. And then when we drink it, we're literally like passing the beverage over the plastic and then directly into our mouths. So the likelihood of leaching and ingesting bisphenols along with whatever other plasticizers might be in that coffee lid are pretty high. And, you know, if you drink coffee out of a plastic lid once a year, okay, not a big deal. But if most people who drink that type of coffee drink it every day, and that's where it becomes a problem. So as the slide says, these molecules are not tightly bound. So they fall out, they migrate easily. And that's where we see shedding or leaching or migration of these chemicals into our food or our water and things like that. So they're in a constant state of falling off and slowly shedding. And these are the things that increase the rate at which those plastic molecules, whether it's BPA or other phthalates, for example, fall off. And that's heat, which I just mentioned. So that's microwaving, hot water, even putting plastics in the dishwasher, putting hot food in it, leaving that plastic water bottle on your back window in your car in the sun. Heat will increase leaching. Oily foods will increase leaching. So if you put oily food like a tomato sauce or a pasta sauce or some kind of, you know, oily food into a plastic container, you're going to increase leaching. The same thing with acidity. If we have highly acidic foods, that's going to increase leaching. And in fact, in the lab, and when they're doing studies on plastic migrations, they're using vinegars and citric acids in order to pull out chemicals out of the plastic. And then abrasion. So if you're scrubbing it, if you're using your Vitamix blender to make nut butter and it's really abrasive and it's scratching up the inside of the container, like that can increase the leaching of bisphenols again, or other plastic compounds. And when we do, it usually looks, this is what everybody has, is this like orange stained Tupperware. And I'm curious if any of your people watching or listening like have these or have these in their kitchens. These are pretty common. These are containers that probably held tomato sauce or tomato soup or pasta sauce, which is acidic because of the tomatoes. It's oily because those things usually contain oil, and it's usually hot when it goes into the container. And so you have this like trifecta of things that increase leaching. And what actually happens, the reason why you can't get these things clean is, and this is like an amazing, this is the extent of my graphic design skills. So, you know, that's sauce and that's plastic. And so what happens is this like physical barrier between, or space between when the plastic stops and the sauce starts begins to blur, because, and so what happens is you get molecules of sauce physically embedded into the matrix of the plastic, which is why running through the dishwasher and running a sponge over it doesn't clean it, because you're not cleaning the outside. The sauce is physically migrated into the structure of the plastic. And the inverse of that is now you have plastic that's integrated into the sauce that you're consuming. So it's just not a good idea for people to be using plastic food storage containers to store these foods.
We did get a question about would apple cider vinegar in a plastic gallon jug have BPA in it?
Good question. So probably not, because the type of plastic is for the big gallon jugs of vinegar. If it's just, I'm thinking of the same thing, is probably a high density polyethylene plastic. So if you turn the bottle upside down, you'll see the little chasing arrows with a little number on the inside. You'll probably see the letters HDPE, high density polyethylene. That type of plastic does not typically contain any BPA. That doesn't mean it's necessarily safe. It just means that it doesn't have BPA, but it it may have some other compounds that we either don't know about yet. There's a little rhyme that I have this in the Talking Toxins course, 5, 4, 1, 2, all the rest are bad for you.
But don't those big jugs, you're saying that we don't know if they leach anything, but do they have phthalates in them?
So that's what some of them may.
Some of them may.
Okay. It's actually 5, 4, 2, all the rest are bad for you, because one is questionable. So what that means is there's like, again, you look in those little chasing arrows and there's a number and it tells you what category of plastic. The category 7 or other is often where you'll see plastics that have BPA.
Okay.
So
and I was just saying, my kind of policy, so to speak, like if I were buying a big jug of vinegar to clean, I'm not that worried about it. But if it's to consume, I will get the glass, even though it's more expensive. I'm pretty picky on that. Like olive oil, vinegar, like
should be in glass.
I basically don't buy hardly anything in plastic, and it is a premium to buy, your nut butter in glass or this in glass. And I'm pretty strict on that. I just make it, my way of life.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And somebody was like, oh my God, Lara, how do you stay sane as you learn all this awful info and the lack of safety? You do your best. I like to jokingly say, I can ruin anything. I'm a good ruiner. Like, you tell me something fun you're doing, and I won't do this because it's annoying and I don't want people to do this. But like, I can be like, oh, cool, that thing you just did, guess what?
So KB has a good question too. Those big blue water bottles that you refill that are hard, but they say BPA free. What's the deal?
So the deal on that is you don't really know. And I'll actually get into that. So I'm going to hold my answer because I'm going to get to the whole BPA free thing. So let's understand a little bit about BPA. This is not a new chemical. It was synthesized in 1891, which I think is pretty outstanding. And it was actually, as it says here, the estrogenic property. So BPA is a synthetic estrogen. It's an endocrine disrupting chemicals. That means it messes with, interferes with, and alters our natural hormones. These estrogenic properties were discovered in the 1930s, so close to 100 years ago at this point. This chemical was actually a contender for pharmaceutical medication. Like, it was supposed to be a medication, but it was too weak of an estrogen, and it was replaced by diethylstilbestrol, which, depending on how old you are, you might know what diethylstilbestrol or DES is. It was a pharmaceutical medication that was given to women, and it caused serious health effects, not for pregnant women, but for their offspring, which are now known as DES sons and DES daughters. And DES daughters primarily, but sons are also starting to, sons and grandsons are starting to exhibit health effects. But in women, it was like ovarian cancers and uterine cancers, vaginal cancers, because their mom took DES while they were pregnant. And that, you know, so we have to understand the history of these chemicals to really get the context in which they were created and potentially used. It didn't obviously get used for medication, but it did find its future in plastics in the 1950s, and it's been in plastics ever since. As I said earlier, metabolites of BPA have been measured in 93% of people tested by the CDC. And according to analysis and research, 99% of BPA exposure in children is actually coming from food. So they're not getting it from touching cash register receipt. They're getting it from the food that they're eating, because they're eating foods that are stored in plastic, packaged in plastic. They're eating with plastic utensils.
Yeah, they
canned foods, even formula, baby formulas. That packaging can often contain BPA as a liner in the can, depending on what it is. And so, you know, this is why practicing avoidance behaviors and doing what you were saying, Bridget, of I'm going to buy my vinegar in glass if I'm going to consume it. If it's for cleaning, I'm not concerned. And that's how we do that. And this is a short list of some of the health effects that or health issues that have been associated with bisphenol exposure. And this is really primarily low dose exposure. So these are not like occupational exposures to these chemicals. These are, you know, what we're actually getting in real life, very low doses of exposure. And we're seeing not necessarily causative, but we're seeing correlations and associations with some of these types of health conditions, which is pretty significant. There's a whole new track of research looking at BPA and its relationship to the digestive system, can lead to inflammatory bowel disease, chronic inflammation of the digestive tract. And the study authors in this, for this paper, had said that this is the first study to show that BPA can negatively impact gut microbial amino acid metabolism in a way that's been associated with irritable bowel disease. And this is where we get into the BPA-free thing. So what's happening is, as a result of consumer demand, plastic product manufacturers have begun to voluntarily remove bisphenol-A from their products. And we can actually thank moms for this. I think it was in the 90s, in the late 90s, it was moms who found out that BPA was used in baby bottles. And they were like, oh, hell no. So there was this group of moms, they called themselves the stroller brigade, and they rolled their baby strollers up onto, you know, some lawn of Congress or some, I don't know if it was a state house or something. And they were like, you have to take this chemical out of our babies' bottles. And what politician is gonna say no to a crowd of moms with babies? It's a bad PR. So BPA was ultimately removed for use in baby bottles. It was banned for use in baby bottles, not other consumer products, but in baby bottles. The problem is this: BPA is just one chemical in this family of bisphenols. And there's dozens of others. I've heard even that there's hundreds of others of bisphenol chemicals. And so what companies did is they just swapped out BPA with sister chemicals like BPS and BPF, but those ones don't have the same kind of consumer awareness as BPA. And so they're not lying when they say it's BPA free, but it's very likely contains BPS or BPF. The molecular structure of these chemicals is nearly identical, and all of the research that's been done to looking at bisphenol S or bisphenol F, they're saying, well, it's just the same if it's not worse. These are what are known as regrettable substitutions. This is so common in this space, is that it's a substitution that we made to swap one product for something that we think is safer, but turns out it's not safer at all, and we come to regret it. Which is, like I said, it's pretty common and pretty upsetting. There was a 2015 study on BPA and BPS in the journal Endocrinology, and they stated that BPA-free plastic products are not necessarily safer than products containing BPA. And this other 2015 study concluded that based on the current literature, BPS and F are as hormonally active as BPA, and they have endocrine disrupting effects. So this is really where, you know, the sort of the what's the expression about your feet meet the pavement, something like that.
Rubber hitting the road.
Rubber hitting the road, the feet meeting the pavement, something like that. Like this is where, again, we can't just kind of browbeat like BPA is bad. We don't know, like, so to that person's question about those big jugs, those big plastic jugs that you maybe go to fill up with water at the store, if you're buying water, like filtered water at the store, it may say BPA free, but it's probably got BPS or BPF in it.
To harden it.
To harden it. If it's a hard, rigid plastic, which those typically are. And, you know, while it's not a guarantee that there's bisphenols in the plastic, if it's a number 7 or other, which is what the category is, it probably has it. We don't know because those recipes to make the formulations of plastic are proprietary. So we don't know.
So, but, you know, one thing on the positive is you're not using a vinegar in there, or you're not heating it, you know, so the transfer won't be as severe.
Yes, likely not. You know, what I usually tell people is, you know, if you have the capacity to decant that into something that's not plastic, great. If whatever you're buying, for example, if it's like, you know, one of those gallon jugs or 5-gallon jugs of water, if you have a not plastic thing to store it in, or if you're drinking it really quickly, like if you go through that 5 gallons in like a week or two, it's not that big of a deal. If that jug of water is sitting in the back of your trunk for 10 days or a month, or sitting in a hot garage,
which my neighbors do. They have a whole rack of them.
Right. Then like maybe and you're in Arizona where it's just hot. So like maybe that's not the ideal. However, I want to also put in a sort of asterisk sidebar conversation of, we have to recognize that in the grand scheme of things, like, we have to learn to prioritize these things. If it's an emergency situation and you're like, hey, we have no food and water, or we have no water, we have no access to clean water, but I have these like 3-year-old jugs of water that maybe is contaminated with BPA, like, you're still going to drink it. And I would still drink it. Like, we have to recognize that it's not what we do once in a while. It's what we do every day that matters. So if it's an every once in a while, like, oh crap, I have to drink this not great water, I want people to understand that they don't need to get stressed out about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And there's, you know, you and I have talked about, like, sometimes just your life situation is changing and you don't have, like, you know, the perfect water set up for a while, or you mentioned you didn't have the greatest bed, even though you knew better for a while. You know, so that's kind of how Lara stays sane and teaches us to do. And then whenever I talk about stuff, I'm like, just do one thing that you're interested in right now. If you've been interested in getting a water filter because you don't have one, then work on that one thing. If you've been, you know, interested in swapping out some beauty products, do that one thing. You don't do it all at once.
You don't do it all at once. And, you know, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And, you know, we work systematically, again, whether we're doing this for ourselves or we're doing this for clients or patients that we serve and support. You know, the idea is not to get overwhelmed. In fact, the idea is to minimize overwhelm. And what I love about this topic is, as soon as we step into taking action, like, that's how we minimize our overwhelm, is by doing something. Like, overwhelm happens when you don't do something and you just build up anxiety about the fact that you're not doing it. And so if we can start taking action, even if they're really small steps, we can start moving in the right direction. And the Talking Toxins course, which I'm going to talk about now, that course is really designed to address the exposures that we get that are the most common, with the criteria that they have the most actionable solutions, right? Like there's a lot of exposures that we get, like Bridget, you mentioned, like, your flooring and stuff like that, and even a mattress, like it's not within everyone's ability to address those things.
Yeah.
But, or even, like what's someone going to rip up their floor and put in a new floor? Not everyone's going to do that. And so we have to start this dialogue as individuals, but also if we're working with other people and educating them, we have to start with what's the most accessible. What are the things that we can have the most impact on in terms of interventions that have the biggest bang for the buck? And that's really why how I designed the Talking Toxins course. The emphasis on that of that course, and I have a couple slides to kind of talk through it a little bit. The emphasis of this course is on practical avoidance, right? How do we reduce our exposures, not just to BPA, but like Bridget said, we're covering things like seafood and pesticides and cookware and food storage containers. We're looking at personal care products and hair dye and makeup. We're looking at, your cleaning products and laundry detergents. Like these are the places that are the most actionable. And, it's not always about buying a different product versus, product A versus product B. Some of them are behavioral changes, but these are all things that have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of reducing exposures quickly. And I'll give you an example before I get into the meat of the course. When we're looking at things like pesticides, we can see a really dramatic reduction in the levels of circulating pesticides in the body. 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days when we switch to eating mostly organic food, like not even 100%. And so like that is avoidance in action. That's the beauty of avoidance. Chemicals like BPA don't sit around in your body for decades. They actually get metabolized and peed out really quickly. But the reason why 93% of the population has these chemicals at any given time is because they're constantly being exposed faster than they can empty it out. Right. And so if we can stop what's coming into the body, then we can help. And again, this is where your detox work can be really helpful in conjunction. This is where we really see that magic happen, is when we practice avoidance. We can sometimes immediately reduce our levels of these chemicals, and then we just have to work to keep them that way. And we do that through practical avoidance. So, like I said, my courses are really designed for health professionals. Anybody can take these, but my goal here is for anybody, and you can translate the word client to friends or family if you want. That's what I usually tell my non-practitioner students, is we want to provide education that's based in research. There's over 800 citations within this course. So everything is cited. There's there's a lot.
I know that took you a while.
Yeah, it took me a while. Basically, for every hour that I teach, there's at minimum 10 hours of research behind it. So this course is 10 hours long. So you can do the simple math on that. So the goal here is really to provide the education and resources to help identify and then eliminate these overlooked exposures that are preventing people from getting well. And I know, I have so many stories that I can share about people who have shared with me, I couldn't get it better. I was dealing with fertility issues. I was dealing with hormone issues. I was dealing with weight issues. And it wasn't until I started addressing toxins that really started to change for me in a significant way. And it's almost always the last thing people address. And I want to change that, because think of how much easier people's journeys would be if they eliminated this, or at least greatly reduced this component. If you are working with clients or patients, like, I want you to get amazing results for the people that you work with. And if you're working on yourself, I want you to get amazing results. And that starts with having to smartly and strategically start reducing those exposures, which is what you learn inside this class. I don't know how many of your folks are the research nerds that go down the rabbit hole, but like I was saying, for every hour of content, there's at least 10 hours of work that went into researching and creating that. And my goal is to eliminate that work for you because most people don't have that time. And, you know, like we said in the opening, you know, my goal is to create people who can stand up as leaders in this growing environmental and detoxification field. And that's what I want to help people create. This was my client, Karen Shoshana. She did this and she said, the information in this course is hugely important to us, to those of us in the field who are working with compromised health. And it's a bit of a disservice to counsel others on how to live a healthy experience and not provide consideration for these elements that are embedded in our cultural experience. And, you know, as she says, she's frankly surprised that this is not included in all nutrition trainings. And then this is my client, Amy. I've known Amy for a bunch of years, at least 8 or 9 years. Amy is the author of a book on PCOS. She runs the PCOS Diva. And she has integrated so much of what I've taught her into her programs, because PCOS is a Bridget, I'm sure you know all about it. I feel like you've taught about it before in your business, is a hormonally driven condition, and it primarily estrogen driven. And so when we have synthetic hormones like BPA, like phthalates, like some of these pesticides, it can add fuel to the fire for these. So these are some of the sort of goals that I have in terms of the topics, and I'll get into how this course works. My goal is I want you to understand the broad scope of toxin exposures that your audience is getting, or that you're getting. I covered a very little bit of this in the very opening of the slides. I want you to be able to articulate why small exposures like what we're getting in our shampoo and laundry detergent and scented candles every day, I want you to be able to articulate why that's important, because it's an often overlooked aspect that's critical to this topic. How exposure to pesticides can contribute to client illness, patient illness, your illness. Here's a big one that I think is so important, is why the environmental working groups Dirty Dozen and Clean 15 list is not enough. So I don't know if your audience is familiar with the EWG's Dirty Dozen or Clean 15, but there's new analysis that shows that that framework and that list is basically meaningless, which I don't say. Yeah, I don't say that lightly, because I really do admire a lot of the work that the EWG has done, but it's a flawed framework that is not as protective as we think it is. Okay. So that's, like I said, I should have a podcast.
That's a great point.
Yeah. I should have a podcast called Lara Ruins Everything, but
no.
I know, it's empowerment. I want to educate and empower. But this is something that I think is important for people to know.
Well, and yeah, and that's the thing, a lot of, and when I see, and not to be too critical, because I know practitioners mean well, but they're like, you know, avoid toxins, look at the Dirty Dozen, Clean 15, and just even saying that is not enough.
It's not enough. It's not.
Yeah.
Look, that would be like, oh, just go, you know, eat healthier. And then people will be like, what does that mean? And you like,
right.
Oh, go lose weight. Like, okay, thanks. But what does that actually mean? Right. And so this is why this degree and level of education, I think, is so important, because it helps us figure out exactly what we're supposed to do. And we can't give broad blanket statements without holding people's hand through the process. So yeah, so like I said, you know, we get into things like seafood, we get into, you know, meat, animal, dairy products, we get into cookware and food storage and plastics and food packaging. We're looking at, you know, what are the safer types of cookware and why? How do we dialogue with our clients about products that they use on their skin, right? Like, why is that important? We talk about hair products, hair dyes, nail polishes. These are practices that people inherently know are inherently toxic. They're like, don't tell me that my hair dye is not safe. I'm like, sorry. But this is really important. And, you know, I want people to have information that is empowering and that can be help reduce risks of serious chronic illnesses. We talk about, sort of different types of certifications in the beauty industry. We talk about air quality inside. We talk about household cleaners, scented candles, air fresheners, all of that stuff. And then, I talk about this throughout the course, is this idea of like, and this, I said this a moment ago, is how do we prioritize the things that are most accessible? So like, I like to lead with what's free and what's easy. So what are free interventions that anybody can do? Like open your windows, take off your shoes. What are things that people can do that can collectively and over time reduce exposures to chemicals and reduce risk factors for disease? And so that's really what we're covering in this course. And then we also have a section at the end where we're really talking about how do we communicate without overwhelming people, right? And I know that that's kind of come up in the comments, like, how do you do this without like losing your mind? We'll talk about that. We will talk about that. So this is what the course includes. There's 28 video lessons in total. It's about 10 hours. It's a 5-week course, so you go one module at a time. There are talking points for practitioners or health professionals that can help to start bridging the conversation with the people that you serve. We also have white labeled client-facing handouts. So if you are talking to your clients about, safer cookware, you don't have to create a handout. We've got that for you. We've done that. You can just download it and stick your logo on it. It's really great. And what I said in the very beginning about this topic really requiring a space for dialogue, I stand by that. So all of my students have ongoing monthly access to me in my office hours session. So even if you do the 5-week course, in a year from now, you can still pop onto our office hours and ask a question, which I think is so great. And then access to our private Facebook group community, which Bridget is in and is a part of, which I love. We have a sweet deal that we put together for you guys, that we're taking $100 off if you decide to join us. I think we said by August 31st. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Great. And you can check out the course. It's talkingtoxins.com. We set up the code DETOX100. And if you apply that at checkout, for people that are wondering, we actually have some extended payment plans in place. Thanks to COVID, we want to make sure that we are making the course really accessible for people. So they're finance free, meaning it does not cost you more to do payment plans, but you get $100 off regardless of which plan that you choose. And, like I said, my goal is to really create a higher level of education and fluency in this space so that people aren't, at the mercy of the internet, at the mercy of Google, trying to figure out what's safe, what's not, what do I need to worry about, and what can I kind of let go of in this process. Yeah. And
I'm just putting the link, the coupon code in here, and then I haven't even created this yet, but I'm going to create like a mold detox protocol handout with like kind of our basics and then like all the extra stuff we do. So that's what I'm going to give people who are joining. Lara has a bunch of information and handouts you can like give to clients, but again, she concentrates more on the education and avoidance, and I'm doing more of the detox. So I'll throw that in there. And really, occasionally I'll get a comment, oh, you're just trying to make money or something. Which luckily I don't get that a lot. But like, honestly, what I'm trying to do is change the world. So I'm trying to create like an army of people who know this stuff and can share this stuff, because it's shocking. You guys are educated, but most people are not educated at all about this stuff. And the more that they go by Roundup and, all this junk, it's all getting into all of our water, all of our bodies. And I see that when we test people. So it's a big problem. I'm super passionate about it. I'm never going to teach this stuff at the level that Lara does. She's fantastic. And I want to like, just, as much as we can, like just spread the message. So Yeah, whether you're just like a passionate mom who, is curious about this stuff. Like you said, with a stroller brigade, like it doesn't really matter. Like all of us can make a difference.
Yeah.
So, and it
Well,
really does have to come from consumers, I think. Like
yes.
it's not coming from the top down. But
No.
eventually they start listening because they're like, yeah, I keep hearing about the problem with pesticides. Maybe, the legislatures start to kind of get it when they keep hearing about it.
Yeah, and I think that, like all great changes have always come from the bottom up in terms of, consumers shifting their choices in the marketplace. And, I think that as consumers, we have this power that we don't acknowledge and we don't yield it. We don't wield it, I should say. And if we look at, I'll look just at skincare, for example, or personal care products or beauty products. When I started doing this work 10, 12 years ago, I could count the number of quote clean beauty brands on one hand, and I couldn't find them in the store. Like I had to order them. And I was like, well, this sucks because there's nothing available. And now there's so many brands I can't even keep up. And that's happened because consumer awareness has shifted. We have stores like Costco, Target, Walmart, CVS, big box stores that are pledging to do better and to start not, being more selective about the products that they sell and making sure that their store brand products don't have, some of these questionable chemicals. They have a long way to go, but they're at least taking a stand. And that happens because consumers are demanding it. So we do have this tremendous power to shape the marketplace. We just don't pay attention to the things. We just don't pay attention to it. And therefore it becomes a power that's unused. And I think that if we inspire people to vote with their dollars and to support the companies that are being fully transparent, that are choosing and prioritizing health, we all ultimately win. When Target has a section in its beauty aisles devoted to like natural products, granted, not all of them are great, but there's some great options in there.
There are.
And then so that levels the playing field, because it means that somebody else, some rando person who's walking to Target might buy a product that's safer without even knowing why.
No, you're so rando person. No, it's true. Like, we don't want to keep this to ourselves. Like, this is the last thing we want to be like, oh, we're cool with our non-toxic living. Like, we want everybody to know this and do this. And in some countries, it's way different than here with the awareness of, I don't know if it was Shelley in New Zealand who was telling me about like how it is there. Like, I was just like, shocked, and they would be shocked to see what goes on here in Arizona. We're not a very aware state. Like, it's insane the amount of like throwaway water bottles we use and stuff like that in a hot place. Like, Portland is 100 times better with stuff like that. So it just becomes like a cultural, awareness. Also in Portland, like basically all my clients use natural cleaning products.
Yeah.
And here, if I were to ask my neighbors or go around, like almost no one does. So it's just awareness. And I think it's really our duty to, if we believe in this stuff, like do our part to become more informed, share the message in whatever way that is.
Yeah. And I want to address, somebody had commented
there's a couple questions I wanted to take.
Had commented and said, I used to help low-income folks navigate the toxic world of food, medicine, environment. It was sad and frustrating that most could not change anything due to high cost of avoidance. So yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things I'll say to that. The first thing is there are many interventions, right? Many ways that you can reduce exposure that don't cost anything and that in fact can save money. So for example, if somebody has scented home products, air fresheners, plug-ins, whatever, even the stupid Christmas tree or, hanging in the inside of the car, those are all exposures to these endocrine disrupting chemicals and other, carcinogens and benzene and other chemicals that are off-gassing from these products or releasing from these products that constitute daily chronic exposure. So if we stop buying those, that is a way to reduce exposure. If we swap out cleaning products, which and it's just swapping one for another. And certainly people can use cleaning vinegar and water and baking soda, which is less expensive than conventional cleaning products anyway. And it's generally speaking, similarly effective, just as effective. You can reduce the amount of respiratory irritants in the home for next to nothing. People can take off their shoes when they come inside. They can reuse their glass, pasta sauce jar or whatever and put their leftovers in it. So there are things that people can do that are more accessible.
Just the same with detox. Sometimes I think people throw that out as just an excuse a bit. It's like, not that you are, but like, it's like, yeah, like not everyone can afford like an organic fancy mattress, but like, you with a little more time, you can cook beans from scratch, and almost for like no more cents now, you can buy a can that's lined with enamel instead of BPA. It's coming, like the price of that is coming way down and becoming way more common. So, we have to look for opportunities and not just like the blocks, and they are there. So that's good. And we had a couple questions, Laura, about coffee maker plastic and coconut products.
Yeah, so the coffee makers, they are all plastic, and they're probably not made with BPA or S or F. I don't know. And the problem is none of us know. The recipes and the formulations of these plastics are proprietary and they don't need to tell us. And those type of plastics typically don't have the little chasing arrows. The chasing arrows, just as an aside, it doesn't mean that the plastic is recyclable. It just puts it in a broad category. It was basically a graphic design mistake when they first came out.
This is recyclable, psych.
Yeah, they're like, right, it doesn't mean they're recyclable. It's just,
oh my God.
The number is just a rough categorization of the type of plastic it is. But those types of products typically don't have those stamps. So we don't even know what type of plastic it is.
Yeah.
Are they made with BPA, S or F? I don't know. I don't know if anybody's looked at it. Certainly if people can switch to something like a glass carafe, like a drip
like a French press. Yeah.
I get that these things are not accessible or available to everyone, financially speaking, to get those. But in an ideal situation, that's what we would be looking at is
yeah, and glass. If you're gonna drink coffee like the rest of your life, like you can, even if you're moderately incomed, you can like invest in that, I think for most people. And what was I gonna say? Oh, those crafts are beautiful. Side note, it drives me crazy the way people recycle in general, and especially in Arizona.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't even talk about that. And then somebody asked a question about coconut milk.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I didn't talk about this, but a lot of chemicals are fat soluble, so they are found in higher percentages in high fat products, which coconut milk is one. So it's a good question that Tobias asked about, like, are you aware of any coconut milk products that are sold in glass? Because it would be amazing if there were. I have not found any.
Well, okay. I definitely coconut oil in glass.
Yes.
And definitely coconut cream can be in an enamel lined can, which from my knowledge, and you can say otherwise, Lara, the enamel lined can is good, because a lot of people are like, that's also a hoax, but I think it's not actually. The enamel's good.
Yeah, so enamel lining is what cans actually used to contain before these epoxy BPA cans were developed. So that's like what they traditionally were made with. And some food companies like Eden Foods and some items, you have to check with the company. They often will say things like BPA non-intent, which means there might be BPA if you test it, but like we didn't add any BPA in, so it's unintentional, and it might be from the machinery that like last canning product in the line used it, and so there's some left over, right? So that's what they mean when they say BPA non-intent. They don't intend it to be there, but like it might still be there a little bit.
Okay.
But so enamel linings in cans are great, but and like Eden Foods, for example, Eden Organic produces like canned beans using enamel lining, but the enamel lining has not been FDA approved as a food contact material for acidic foods. So even Eden Organics canned tomatoes are used the regular BPA.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, and that's like, you know, Native Forest has coconut milk. The coconut milk may, I don't know, because again, they change it all the time, or, you know, they can change it, meaning the lining. But they sell things like, you know, canned pineapple, which is highly acidic. So that one probably does not contain the same lining as something like a coconut.
Enamel.
So,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, yeah, well, I think I learned this, but now I forget. Those like boxes of broth, for example, with some lining there. What's going on with that?
Aseptic boxes.
Okay.
Yeah, so those, and these are like, think of like the juice box, that type of shelf-stable, you know, palmy tomatoes or whatever. So the lining, so those boxes are made from cardboard, metal, like a metal foil, and plastic, polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, which is what your Poland Spring water bottle is made out of. So they're not no risk, because PET plastic can leach phthalates and antimony and some other compounds. So
yeah, that's a bummer, to be honest.
It is a bummer.
There's some really delicious foods that come in those boxes.
Yeah, and like, here's the thing, you know, like I drink coconut milk in my matcha tea, and the coconut milk that I've found that works for me, even though it has some exposure, is one that's packed in those aseptic boxes.
Gotcha.
It's probably less than what I would get from BPA in a can, but like, I don't really know. And so I share that to say, like, this is not about perfection.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there are things.
Reduction.
It's about reduction and doing the best that we can, and still maintaining as much of our quote normal lives as we are.
Yeah, and then there's the whole detox factor, which, you know, we test people with one of the panels for chemical toxins.
Yeah.
And it is crazy what comes out. There's, you know, people who are like, I buy my meat from an organic local farm and I have a water filter, and like, people still pesticide levels sky high. So some of that's the load that's, you know, overall in your body. A lot of my clients have mold toxicity. Their liver isn't working great. And then their genetics are a factor in there. So it's not, unfortunately, not quite as simple as just avoidance and you're good.
Yes, exactly.
But you still have to do it. You still
have to do it. So like, the way that one of the many analogies that I use is that if you, like, your hand was in a pot of boiling water, you wouldn't try to treat the burns while your hand was still in there. Like, you have to take your hand out of the boiling water and then you can treat the wound. It's pretty basic logic, right? But that's, I think, when we step into detox without focusing on any avoidance, we're trying to treat a wound that's still actively being created.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I love like how you explain that. And yeah, and another tricky thing with toxins is we're exposed to so many, right? Like, they're all mixed together, and then they sometimes accentuate each other. So it's hard to look at a one disease condition and say, oh, you got this because of BPA or pesticides or whatever. It's all mixed together, but it's just the foundation you have to lay. And I know I'm like preaching in the choir to say that to my audience, but this is something that you can help teach other people or just know much better for yourself from taking these courses. I mean, if you're into nerding out about health, these courses are going to be like amazing for you. And then you can go on to like a higher level course that's more interactive. It's, you know, and it's a joy to do. I'll probably do some of them again, because like, it's hard to remember all this stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot in there. And, you know, like I've been saying, you know, the goal is education and empowerment, right? Like, when we know better, we can do better.
Yeah.
And when we understand how to navigate the situation and how to prioritize, like, somebody just asked a question about, like, how do I prioritize BPA versus mold? I'll say mold first. That's more can cause.
Oh, okay. I didn't understand that. Yeah, mold is a huge disruptor of so many systems, and Lara knows all about that. Yeah, so almost like with mold, because you're so weakened, you have to, and I just actually yesterday my talk aired in the mold summit about this. Like mold is often going to increase your chemical sensitivity
Yeah.
because your body's on high alert and it can't take any more. So you
Yeah.
just have to reduce that load to just give your body a chance to heal while you really actively work on the mold piece, I would say.
Yeah. But I mean, I do think that, like, like I said, when we know better, we do better. And my goal is to help people strategically start addressing the exposures that are easiest to address, like address the ones that are easiest to address, like start with the low hanging fruit. Like Bridget, you mentioned my bed earlier. Like I've shared this with my students, is that like I was like 8 years into this work before I finally swapped out my bed, not because I didn't know about it, but because it was an expensive item that,
Right.
it cost more to address it. And so, we start with the things that are free, that are easy, that don't have a lot of barriers to adoption. And then we move on. And,
Right.
there's definitely, I think, also to kind of piggyback on what you were saying about, like, everybody's different. We can't just like avoid and expect everything to go away. Everybody has their sort of genetic weak links or whatever health issue they have going on. But I'll share a quick story about somebody who emailed me a while back, and she's like, "Hey, I'm a health professional. Like, here's all my trainings and certification, and I'm not saying this to toot my horn, but because it matters in the context of this story." And she said, I started a period of time ago, I started losing my hair. Like my hair was falling out in like chunks. And it was devastating. And I did hair mineral analysis. I took all the tests. I, did thyroid tests. I, worked with so many different practitioners. Nothing would fix it. And I just kept cutting my hair shorter and shorter. And I was crying myself to sleep every night. And it was awful.
Yeah.
And she said, I heard you talk on a podcast talking about water contamination. And she goes, a light bulb went off. And I realized that our water system broke 3 months before the hair loss started. And I replaced the water system. I got it fixed. And almost right away, the hair loss started to slow. And then after a couple of weeks, it stopped and my hair is finally growing back in. And like, it changed my life. And for her, like, it's sort of like results may vary. Not everybody is going to have that situation.
Right.
I don't even know what was in her water. I have no idea. I don't know if she knows. But the point is, for her, that was the one thing that was keeping her stuck. And nobody else was able to nobody else even thought to question, hey, what, like, do you have a filter in your shower? Do you know what's in your water?
Right. I would love if I someday have like the resources or whatever to do a just purely detox experiment on kind of mainstream obese folks.
Yeah.
And see what happens, because there are still so many factors, because just like with mold, okay, now maybe your thyroid's off and this is off and that's off.
Yeah.
But I just see so many people when I'm out, and I can just feel like the toxicity of the weight they're holding on to, I'm like, oh, I keep my mouth shut, but I just kind of want to say, God, you're just exposing yourself to so much plastic and so much pesticide and so many additives, and it's just making you heavier and heavier.
And even if you stopped exposing yourself, you're now exposing yourself internally because your body will release those.
You're detoxing. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
But I really, and we could talk all day, but I'm fascinated by the weight piece with toxins. It's so underexplored and under-discussed. And there's so many people struggling with their weight. So that's just also can be a great one to pass on to clients or use in your own body.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole class of chemicals called obesogens that like mess with your metabolism in ways that lead to weight gain regardless of what you're eating. So like that's,
people just don't even think about it, and they're going to CrossFit like 5 hours a day and all this stuff, and I'm like, oh my God, you just need to detox. So thank you so much for coming on, Lara. I just love your information. We have the link here in the course. Barbara, yeah, how toxic your home dust is probably depending on your situation, but just generally chemicals collect and other toxins collect in dust. So that's just another practically free way to like reduce your toxins.
Yeah. And Barbara, there's an entire lesson inside Talking Toxins on house dust because it's an important topic. So
yeah, honestly, it's gotten me more like interested in cleaning, you know, like I don't just think it's a chore. Like I feel just really good about my environment when it's clean. So that's trying to change my perspective on that. So, well, thanks for everyone who was live. Great questions. I don't remember who's on. Oh no, wait. I think next week we have Missy Bain also talking about like detox and intermittent fasting. So that's going to be a really fun one. We're kind of on a little toxin theme. And then we have Great Plains Laboratory coming on to talk about their toxins and molds testing the week after that. So we've got some fun stuff coming up in this toxin series. And we'll post this replay and also send an email with some more info on the course and what you'll learn in there. So
yeah, and if anybody has any questions, just my email door is open. People can any questions they have my way.
Knocking on her email door.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone. Till next time. Bye. Turn off my Facebook.
I think I have to end it.
Oh, because you're in charge now. Can you turn off the Facebook?
Okay. Bye, everyone.